Now let's begin exploring the legal realities that nursery owners must navigate when it comes to safeguarding investigations and allegations. The next session, regulatory framework, hopefully will help us understand the legal landscape and how different regulatory bodies become involved when a safeguarding concern arises. Our speaker is highly respected in this field. Chloe Parish is a partner in the Regulatory Law Department at Stephensons, specialising in defending individuals and organisations facing investigation or enforcement action by the regulatory bodies, including Ofsted. Her insight into regulatory law and how it plays out in real-world nursery settings is incredibly valuable. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Chloe Parish, partner at Stephensons Solicitors.
Hopefully you can hear me okay. I've actually been at Stephensons for 10 years this year. I look a bit younger in that picture, unfortunately. Yeah, I've been in the regulatory team for several years. As Adam touched upon, I deal with Ofsted primarily. That's sort of my key area of work that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So that includes nurseries, childminders, social care providers as well, who are regulated by Ofsted. And yeah, basically the full breadth really. In addition to that, I do also look after other types of clients that have got regulatory issues. That might be professionals that are having problems with their regulators too. I have done a slide there that just sort of provides an overview of what we do. On a day-to-day basis in relation to my Ofsted clients, I'm usually helping them with enforcement action. So Jackie mentioned before about suspension of registration. That is probably one of the key things that I deal with every day. And that can be nurseries, but it also can be childminders, as I mentioned before. I also deal with appeals to the first tier tribunal. So that would be in relation to a suspension, but also other enforcement action. And I also actually deal with challenging inspections as well. So I help providers go through that process when they're not happy with the way that an inspection has been dealt with by Ofsted. Which can happen to any provider regardless of the grading that you've been given. So in terms of what I'm going to cover today, enforcement action, Ofsted's powers. Not everybody is fully aware of the different powers that Ofsted actually have. I'm going to talk you through some of those powers, when they're likely to be used, what situations you could find yourself in that would result in that. The key one that I will focus on a little bit more is suspension of registration, because generally speaking, suspension of registration will arise off the back of a safeguarding incident that's quite serious. And that's really where the biggest risk lies for most providers. And then I will touch upon LADO as well, because LADO do play a part in all of this too. So if a safeguarding incident happens, you guys will know, they also become involved. So what are Ofsted's enforcement powers? They're actually split up into two different types. So we have criminal enforcement action over here. I've just listed the different types of enforcement action, but I'm not actually going to go into a lot of detail in regards to criminal enforcement action. And the reason for that is because when a safeguarding incident happens within a setting, it actually usually triggers the police to do an investigation, and they sort of take that away from Ofsted in a way. So criminal enforcement action is usually separate to something that's related to safeguarding. But they do have those powers, and that's something to be aware of. Civil enforcement action is what we're going to focus on today, or what I'm going to focus on today, because that is the action that Ofsted will take in various different circumstances. So we've got an action, welfare requirements notice. They're probably the two things that you guys will have heard of and come across because of inspections. Cancellation of registration and suspension of registration. I should say actually, in relation to the civil enforcement action, these four things can all be used in one go. So they don't have to just use one and then move to the next one. They can actually use them all simultaneously, which can have a huge impact on a provider. There are times when they might start with an action and then work their way up if they don't feel that a provider is dealing with something appropriately. But I have also seen them suspend registration and then go for cancellation whilst the setting is suspended, because the two things run next to each other. So the first bits that I just wanted to cover is raising an action and welfare requirements notice. The reason I've put both of them in here is because we do see them. I would say that actions we actually see when a serious safeguarding incident happens, an action's not normally raised in relation to that. It's normally a welfare requirements notice. However, Ofsted will put you under the spotlight. So if something's happened and you end up being suspended, for example, they will come in and they'll either do a monitoring visit or they'll do a full inspection. And if you've got multiple settings, sometimes it can actually trigger inspections at some of your other provisions as well. Ofsted communicate with the different areas around the country. So you might have specific inspectors that come to some of your settings in a certain area, but they do talk. So you might find that you're under the spotlight a bit and you're getting a few more visits from Ofsted. But that can actually trigger actions being raised because when they come and do an inspection, they're looking at everything. They're being they can be quite critical at times, and that will sometimes lead to actions being raised. So it's usually off the back of an incident, but not direct in respect of that incident. I'm sure most of you will probably be aware, but they can raise an action in relation to learning and development requirements, but they can also raise an action in relation to safeguarding. As I said, safeguarding is I would say more rare. It's normally they would raise a WRN in relation to safeguarding when it's been particularly serious. And they normally raise an action if they feel that the leaders and managers know what they're doing and they're basically, they just feel that satisfied that you will deal with it appropriately and you'll put the steps in place to manage the situation. Welfare requirements is slightly different. They can only issue a WRN in relation to basically safeguarding. They can't do it in relation to learning and development. That's something just to be aware of. I've never seen Ofsted do that because they tend to know what they can issue things in relation to, but it's something just to keep in mind. So in respect of cancellation of registration, I'm not going to focus too much on this because it is quite rare. I do deal with cancellation, but what I would say, it tends to be more in relation to when a provider has failed to meet the requirements on several inspections. It's normally off the back of poor inspections. It's rare that it comes off the back of a really serious safeguarding incident. It will just depend on the circumstances of the case. But I've just done there what the sort of process is for cancellation of registration. So first of all, it's not immediate. So when they decide to take steps to cancel, they take it in like a staged process. So they will issue a notice of intention to cancel, and that basically will set out why they intend to cancel your registration, the reasons that they have. You can then object to that, and you can do that in writing, you can do it in person, and then representations are considered by Ofsted, and they will make a decision whether or not to still continue with that action. And if they do, you will be issued with a notice of decision, which can then be appealed to the first tier tribunal. In my experience, when it comes to a particular incident happening, I've only ever really seen, I think, one case where one serious incident happened that triggered suspension, but then during the suspended period, some of their other settings were looked into and inspected, and there were further safeguarding concerns raised. It was in relation to understanding when child protection concerns might need to be referred, and there'd been quite a serious failure to do that, that had resulted in quite serious harm to a child. And because there were other concerns at other settings, they actually decided that they just didn't have faith in the provider anymore, and so they took steps to cancel registration. That is quite rare because quite often, if there's multiple settings, it actually is usually just a sort of a management failure rather than more senior level failures. In that case, it was more senior level that were aware of the issues and weren't referring things on properly. And cancellation is, I've said there, is discretionary, so Ofsted don't have to take steps to cancel. It's ultimately their decision. They do have to justify why they're taking that step. But As I say, I don't want to focus too much on cancellation because it's rare. Suspension of registration. So I'm going to focus on this a bit more because, as Jackie's touched upon, this is what we tend to see when an incident happens. Essentially, this is urgent enforcement action. So if an incident happens and you make a notification to Ofsted, that will essentially trigger Ofsted to review the situation and take steps to suspend. They normally will ring the nursery that day and say, we're suspending you. And at that point, that's when the nursery has to get all the children to basically go home, and they can't reopen the following day. It's initially for a 6-week period, so they will issue suspension notices within 6-week intervals. They have the power to resuspend, so after the 6 weeks, that's when they will resuspend for another 6 weeks. And they will keep doing that until they are satisfied that that risk is no longer there. I will talk about the grounds in a minute. They must keep the suspension under review, so that's usually where I come in. So if I've got a client who is suspended, I'll obviously look at the circumstances as to why they're suspended, but I will usually put pressure on Ofsted to do what they need to do at their end. There are sometimes limitations to that if there are other agencies involved. Ofsted aren't always the lead agency. So the grounds for suspension. It's essentially that the Chief Inspector reasonably believes that the continued provision of childcare by the registered person to any child may expose such a child to a risk of harm. So the words may and risk of harm, that is a low threshold test, because you don't even have to demonstrate that a child has come to harm in order for suspension to happen. So you can have very serious allegations made where there's been no findings in relation to those allegations that can result in suspension. And Ofsted will apply that test in different circumstances and decide whether the threshold is met, and then they will take steps to suspend if they feel that it is met. So I've said there, it's just a perceived risk. It doesn't even have to be actual risk. So what is likely to meet the grounds for suspension? I've put them into categories because this is what we tend to see. A serious allegation of harm, so sexual abuse and or inappropriate sexual conduct. So that's usually in relation to an employee. And it could be an incident that is alleged to have taken place on the setting, in the setting, but it also can be outside of the setting as well. So we have seen it before where the police have arrested somebody, like a staff member, and that has resulted in the setting being suspended just while the police conduct those initial inquiries to make sure that none of those concerns have sort of transferred into the setting. In that particular instance where we've had that scenario, the suspension was lifted quite quickly because it was established there were no problems with the setting and nothing had taken place within the premises. But we have also seen it before where suspension has been maintained for a longer period because the allegation has been direct in respect of the nursery. And the reason why suspension remains in place is because although you can't always control everything that somebody does, but it will give rise to concerns about supervision and how something could have potentially happened on the premises. And that's why Ofsted will suspend whilst they're looking into that and they're looking at basically what the circumstances were. Physical harm as well, emotional abuse and neglect. You will have seen from some of the high-profile cases they're things that have come into play, and that has actually resulted in the police prosecuting them. There are also serious incidents that result in suspension sometimes as well. So again, I think Jackie touched on this before. Deaths of children, unfortunately, that sometimes is completely unavoidable and there's absolutely nothing that the nursery could have done differently. There are occasions where there are things that could have been done differently. For example, it could relate to like an allergy. It could relate to the way that staff have dealt with a child or checked on a child. Sometimes as well, when a serious incident happens, there might not be failings in relation to that specific incident, but there could be things around that have perhaps contributed to it. So if you're out of ratios, for example, that could be something that Ofsted will have a concern in relation to. Something that's probably a little bit lower down, I would say, a child escaping a setting. Actually, I've had clients that have called me the day that has happened, and I've talked to them through the process and said to them, when you're notifying Ofsted, make sure you tell them what you've done to rectify the situation so it doesn't happen again. Because believe it or not, sometimes I've had clients that have come to me where a child has escaped and they've notified Ofsted, but in the notification, they've not given all of the information, they've not said what they've done to rectify it, and then that's why Ofsted have suspended, because they're really concerned that they don't quite understand the seriousness of the incident. So, as I say, that is something where you could potentially avoid if the child hasn't come to serious harm and a member of the public has brought them back in, or the nursery have realised. It's potentially an incident where you could avoid suspension. It's just about how you deal with it. With suspension of registration as well, when there's an ongoing police investigation, which quite often there is, the police are usually the lead agency, and Ofsted have to take a bit of a back seat, so they will keep the suspension in place whilst the police do their investigation. In the regulations, Ofsted are only supposed to keep a suspension in place for 12 weeks when there's an ongoing investigation. However, there are exemptions to that. So they can keep the suspension in place if those police inquiries are still ongoing and there's quite a reasonable chance of that basically resulting in some outcomes, some negative findings. So we have seen it where suspension has been in place for longer than 12 weeks. As well, in relation to suspension, if you have an incident at one setting and you have more than one setting, normally suspension only applies to the one nursery. Whereas cancellation of registration, if you have one company that's registered with Ofsted and you've got all of your settings under that particular registration, cancellation applies to all of them. But suspension is each individual setting. So I have seen it before where, because of the seriousness of the concern, they have suspended other settings within the provider's sort of umbrella, but it's rare, very rare. Normally, they just keep it to that one provision. And that's normally because you've normally got different managers in different settings, and normally it relates to the specific management of that nursery. And providing they're satisfied that the overall provider is dealing with it, they'll let you continue to run your other provisions. So how long will the suspension remain in place? It's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, but generally it can be a few days. As I mentioned before, if you do all the right things, it's something that you can demonstrate you're reducing that risk that is perceived. You can get that suspension lifted. There are certain circumstances, for example, police investigations, very, very serious incidents that might involve inquests and things like that. The chances are you'll be suspended for a bit longer. Normally longer than the initial 6 weeks. It can sometimes go into the 12 weeks and a bit longer. But the purpose of my involvement is to assess whether or not you are ready to appeal that. So there is a route of appeal. There's a mechanism to challenge a suspension notice. It's a very short timescale. You have to appeal within 10 working days of actually getting the notice, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important that you get in touch with your insurers when you are suspended, because the sooner that I get involved, the sooner I can assess where you're up to and whether or not we're ready to appeal. So I've had cases where at the outset I've said it's premature to appeal. The tribunal are not going to lift a suspension at the moment because of the ongoing investigations, or because the nursery's not done enough to actually put themselves in a position where they've rectified that risk that is perceived. But then I've also had clients where we've got to the 12 weeks and they are ready to appeal and we're good to go, and so we lodge an appeal. That normally triggers Ofsted to look at the reasons why they're still keeping the suspension in place, and quite often we don't actually have to go to an appeal hearing. Ofsted will lift the suspension before we need to do that. It's a balancing act really in terms of when we appeal. The appeal process is quite shortened down, so when you appeal a cancellation to a tribunal, it can take months to get there. If you're not suspended, you can continue operating in that time. If you are suspended, that has obviously huge implications financially and on your reputation. With a suspension, because of how urgent it is, because you can't operate, your appeal is dealt with by the tribunal within a couple of weeks. So we'd lodge an appeal, and then we have lots of directions that we have to deal with in a really short space of time. That includes things like witness statements and collating all of your supporting evidence. So I mentioned before about the example of a child escaping. We've had one before where we did appeal it to the tribunal, and we served a witness statement that had all of the steps in place, detailed in relation to what they had done to ensure that that did not happen again. And that involved disciplinary action against certain staff members, but it also involved changing some of their procedures and policies. That was during COVID, so it was a more difficult situation because there were reasons why things like doors and windows and whatever were being left open. That suspension was lifted before we got to the hearing, about 2 days before the hearing. The Ofsted decided to lift. One of the things with suspension I mentioned earlier on, if you find yourself suspended, it will put you under the spotlight more with Ofsted. Ofsted are under the spotlight themselves, as we know. They want to ensure that they are doing everything to protect children, probably protect themselves a little bit as well, because they don't want another incident to happen. And that will mean going into settings, into your other nurseries if you've got them to inspect, and just sort of taking that approach where they are really putting you under the spotlight and looking at your processes. And if they found a concern at one nursery, for example, if they feel that the manager has not done something in relation to recruitment, and that has resulted in potentially a risk of harm to children, they would then focus on that in your other settings. So they would go in and see how your other managers are dealing with it in those settings. So often I'm saying to clients when they've been criticised or they've had, let's say, a WRN for recruitment or a WRN for ensuring that staff understand whistleblowing, because sometimes that's a problem. When they go into their other settings, they will look at those things specifically and they will really drill down. So my advice is often, before Ofsted do that, you get on that and make sure that everything's in line, because that stops you from having other enforcement action to your other settings. And it actually helps you with that particular suspension notice as well. If they can see that all of your other settings are doing well and everybody's acting in accordance with your own policies, it will put you in a much better position with the suspension and to argue that that suspension isn't necessary. I've mentioned here that it can give rise to other concerns. So we have seen when an incident has happened that it gives rise to other issues, not just in respect to that one thing. So failing to report significant events, we've had that come up a few times. We've had poor incident recording and record keeping. That often relates to the incident itself. They might say that, well, that incident has not been recorded clearly, an accident form wasn't filled out and given to the parents, lack of compliance with ratios, which unfortunately that is something we see quite a lot, but it's understandable because recruitment is so difficult at the moment. Sometimes providers find themselves in a situation where a manager's having to cover a room and that can just cause problems throughout. A failure to properly risk assess. Quite often, if a child has been able to get out of a nursery, for example, or has been left in the garden and everybody's gone inside, usually that will come down to the way that the nursery is risk assessing or doing the checks at the end of each session and things. Quite often though, if it is in relation to a risk assessment, they will look at all of your other risk assessments as well and just check that you are properly assessing risk throughout the nursery. It's not working. Oh. Sorry, it's been a bit slow, yeah. There we go. So I guess the takeaway from that is that context is relevant to a suspension. It doesn't just because something happens, a serious incident, it doesn't mean you're going to be suspended, but it's really important you communicate the way that you communicate to Ofsted about what's happened. Obviously, you've got to be completely open and transparent with them, but be open and transparent about the steps that you have taken to rectify that and make sure it doesn't happen again. That is the biggest thing that I would say is communication with Ofsted. They really don't like it when providers are not open and transparent with them, and I've seen more and more them raising concerns about honesty of providers. So just be open with them when something goes wrong, and normally they might be a bit more supportive when you're in that position. In terms of protecting yourself, and this might seem really basic, but unfortunately we do see basic things, or things that might seem basic, actually coming into play, and that being the reason why this situation has happened, whichever situation it may be. So protecting yourself, recruitment, make sure all of your recruitment procedures are fully robust. So make sure they're in line, obviously, with the EOIFS and your requirements. Make sure managers are using their professional curiosity. So we have seen cases where Ofsted have looked at recruitment records, and although the recruitment checks look like they are in place, when you actually delve deeper, for example, you might have an employee that has been employed in a nursery setting before, but no reference has been obtained from that setting, even though that's where they worked beforehand. It's really important that recruitment is followed as robustly as possible, and that managers understand why that is so important. And most managers do. That ultimately they do. It's just making sure that it's done for every single employee that comes through the door. Policies and procedures, again, feels like it might go without saying really, but making sure they're being regularly reviewed and cascaded down. One of the, I think, struggles that I have certainly seen some providers have is when they're growing very quickly and acquiring other nurseries. Their policies and procedures can become a bit muddled, and there might be contradictions between certain policies and procedures that they have in place. Really, normally there's one set that apply to all provisions, but when you're getting new people coming in, there can be changes made, and sometimes they can contradict each other. It's really important that, that's not the case, that all managers are aware of the current policies and procedures, and that they're being cascaded down to staff as well. If you are a provider where you've got lots of settings, that is probably even more key when it comes to cascading down, because it's much harder to have oversight of every single setting every day. Whistleblowing. So again, this is something that we've certainly seen providers criticised for. So if there have been concerns about another staff member, whether that be abuse of a child, it could just be, it could be emotional abuse, it could be the way they're talking to a child, or maybe they're being a little bit rough with a child. That can be, it's serious, and quite often staff don't always know who they should be talking to. One of the things with whistleblowing as well is that comes up is that Ofsted will keep a suspension in place if they feel that the safeguarding culture is not at the level it should be. It's not an open culture. And that usually is because staff haven't been whistleblown when they've seen something happen. So an incident might have happened in a room with several staff members, and they've all witnessed it, and nobody has told management about it, and therefore it can't be acted on. Incident recording and reporting, we've touched on that already. Just making sure that they're accurately recorded and reported. Accident forms is a big one. I think when an accident happens, sometimes if it's very, very serious, it's not the priority, understandably, but then it kind of gets pushed to the side, and then Ofsted will question you as to why you've not done an accident form. It's really important that that's done as soon as is practical, really, in the context of the situation. And risk assessments, again, we've touched on that. I think one of the things that has come across, and certainly has been a suggestion by Ofsted, is that providers sometimes treat that as a tick box exercise. So in the morning, when you might get a staff member going around the garden, checking the garden, they just tick it off. They're not actually looking, and that is certainly something that has come about because children have managed to escape from a gate that's not locked. It's been left open, and clearly that risk assessment has not been done fully or robustly in the morning. It's so important that if that role is delegated to younger, well, not younger staff, but some of the staff that have not been there as long, that are not as qualified, that might not be the manager or the deputy manager, because that's certainly the case in some settings. Sometimes it is delegated to the person that's first on the premises, and that could be a staff member. Make sure that they understand the role that they are playing with risk assessments and how vital it is. Because as I say, that has resulted in Ofsted suspending. Human error, I guess. So LADO, what role do they play? You guys, again, will already know this because I'm sure you make notifications to LADO, but when a serious incident has occurred or a serious allegation, the local authority, the designated officer, LADO, will be notified, and that will either be by you guys, you might make the notification yourselves, but other providers, other third parties, I should say, may make the referral. So that could be the police. So if the police receive an allegation directly, so if a child goes home and makes an allegation against a staff member, normally that parent may well report it straight to the police. They might not go to you guys direct. If they do that, the police will speak to LADO, LADO will speak to Ofsted, and it has that sort of trickle-down effect, and then you will become aware of the situation. You may not be told what the allegation is. Sometimes the police don't give you that information, but you may well be suspended. And that's one of the real difficulties with suspension of registration, is sometimes we don't know the full reasons. We're just told a very serious allegation has been made. And my role is to try and get that information at some point. Sometimes the police just can't give us that information, but sometimes we'll get to a point where they will start to disclose a bit more info. That usually comes to light when we've got some interviews under caution. And essentially, the LADO will oversee the management of allegations against staff. And that can be a specific allegation against a staff member. It can also be safeguarding concerns can be raised about the way that situations have been dealt with. So if during the course of dealing with a very serious allegation, there are concerns about the way that other members of staff have dealt with some concerns that may have arisen, that have led to that overall allegation being made, they can actually become subject to a LADO sort of allegations meeting, and they may find themselves in a situation where they're having safeguarding decisions made against them, for example, substantiated decisions that they've actually put a child at risk of harm. So normally, though, the LADO don't investigate. I think that's one thing to be aware of. They oversee the way that matters are dealt with. Once they get the go-ahead by the police, if the police are involved, they will then speak to the provider, and they will tell them how they want them to deal with that concern. So if they've got specific concerns about specific staff members, what they are likely to do is say to you, well, we want you to go away and do your own independent investigation in relation to this. They may actually ask you to instruct somebody external. If it's concerning somebody that's quite senior in the company, they may say to you, it can't be somebody internal that's investigating this because of how senior they are. You need to get somebody completely independent. And there are, solicitors, there are companies out there that will do that for you. And the LADO, essentially, they provide advice and guidance to other agencies as well. Ofsted take the LADO's lead quite a lot, so they will see what the LADO are doing, and off the back of that, it will help them make their decisions. So in some cases that I have seen, we've had witness statements from the LADO that Ofsted have relied upon in their case. They're very much on the same page with things. So if the LADO is not happy with the way that the setting has dealt with a situation, Ofsted will also not be happy with the way that you've dealt with that situation. So often we will see the LADO raise some criticisms about certain things, so staff knowledge of safeguarding, whistleblowing, recruitment. Off the back of those concerns being raised by LADO, Ofsted will issue a welfare requirements notice, for example, and ask that you make improvements to that. Allegation management meetings, you may be invited to those. I sometimes support clients with those meetings if they are invited. Sometimes the nominated person is invited, and I will go along with them just to support. That's usually when there's a suspension in the background. Normally, there's a suspension hanging in the background when you're invited to an allegations management meeting. and it gives you an opportunity to understand why that suspension is still in place.